Something in your energy has shifted, and the avoidant can feel it even if they can't articulate what's changed. You're not angry anymore. You're not hurt. You're not chasing or questioning or trying to understand. You've simply stopped. Stopped investing emotional energy into someone who gives nothing back. Stopped hoping they'll change. Stopped waiting for the consistency that never comes. Stopped believing in the potential of someone who refuses to meet you halfway. The avoidant has been through relationship cycles before, has seen people pull away temporarily only to come back, has weathered storms of anger and tears and ultimatums, knowing that eventually things would return to the familiar pattern. But this is different. This isn't withdrawal as strategy. This isn't distance as punishment. This is genuine disengagement, complete emotional departure. The quiet closing of a door the avoidant didn't realize could actually close. You've given up, not in a dramatic door slamming way, but in a quiet, final, irreversible way. And the avoidant, who thought they wanted your absence, who claimed they needed space, who pushed you away repeatedly, is about to experience an internal collapse so complete it will rewrite their understanding of themselves and what they've lost. The avoidant psychology is built on a fundamental assumption. People will always pursue them. They've learned through years of experience that if they create distance, others close it. If they pull away, others chase. If they become unavailable, others become more available to compensate. This pattern has reinforced their avoidant tendencies because it's always worked. They've never had to face the real consequence of their withdrawal because someone always pursued them back into connection. But you've broken the pattern. You've stopped pursuing. You've stopped compensating. You've stopped doing the emotional labor that allowed their avoidance to function without consequence. And now the avoidant is about to experience something they've managed to avoid their entire relational life. The complete collapse of their psychological framework when no one is there to catch them. The collapse doesn't happen all at once. It moves through stages, each one dismantling another layer of the avoidance defenses until they're left exposed to feelings they've spent their life suppressing. These stages aren't neat or linear. The avoidant might cycle through them multiple times, might experience several simultaneously, might get stuck in one for months, but the progression is real. And it's devastating because each stage strips away another comfortable lie the avoidant has told themselves, another protective mechanism they've relied on, another way they've avoided facing the truth about themselves and their patterns. When you give up on the avoidant, you're not just ending a relationship. You're triggering an internal earthquake that will shake every foundation they've built their sense of self upon. Stage 1. Denial and misinterpretation. The first stage begins when the avoidant notices the shift in your energy but refuses to interpret it accurately. They tell themselves you're just busy, you're going through something, you're giving them the space they claimed they needed. They convince themselves this is temporary, that you'll re-engage soon, that nothing fundamental has actually changed. The avoidant is so accustomed to people pursuing them that they can't immediately comprehend that you've actually stopped. Their mind reaches for explanations that preserve their worldview rather than accepting the reality that would shatter it. During this stage, the avoidant might actually feel relieved. Finally, they think you're backing off. Finally, the pressure is gone. Finally, they can breathe without someone demanding emotional availability they can't provide. They interpret your withdrawal as you finally understanding what they need, finally respecting their boundaries, finally giving them the independence they've been fighting for. This interpretation allows them to feel comfortable, even validated. They knew you were too clingy. They knew you wanted too much. Now you're adjusting your expectations, and everything can proceed on their terms. But underneath the relief, there's a subtle discomfort the avoidant can't quite name. Your absence feels different from when they created distance. When they withdrew, they still felt your presence energetically, still sensed you thinking about them, still knew they occupied space in your mind and heart. But now there's nothing. No energetic pull, no sense of being held in your thoughts, just emptiness where your attention used to be. The avoidant tries to dismiss this discomfort, tells themselves they're imagining things, insists everything is fine, but the unease persists, gnawing at the edges of their awareness. The denial extends to minimizing the relationship's importance. The avoidant tells themselves it wasn't that serious anyway. You weren't that compatible. The connection wasn't that deep. They could easily find someone else, someone less demanding, someone who doesn't need so much. These narratives protect them from confronting what's actually happening. If the relationship didn't matter that much, then your withdrawal doesn't matter that much. If you weren't that special, then losing you isn't that significant. The avoidant constructs these stories with increasing desperation as evidence accumulates that contradicts them. During this stage, the avoidant might test you without consciously realizing they're testing. They reach out with something casual, expecting your usual response. When you reply briefly without engagement or don't reply at all, they tell themselves you're busy. They might try again, watching for the warmth and enthusiasm you used to show. When it's absent, they start to feel the first tremors of something they can't name. Still, they push it down. Still, they insist everything is normal. Still, they refuse to see what's becoming increasingly obvious. You're gone and you're not coming back. Stage 2, confusion and investigation. The second stage arrives when the avoidant can no longer maintain their denial. Too much evidence has accumulated. Your absence has persisted too long. Your responses, if you respond at all, are too detached. Something has fundamentally changed, and the avoidant is forced to acknowledge it, even if they don't understand it. This stage is characterized by confusion so profound it destabilizes the avoidant's sense of reality. They don't understand what happened. They don't understand why you've changed. They don't understand what they did to trigger this complete withdrawal. The confusion drives the avoidant to investigate. They review your last interactions obsessively, searching for the moment everything shifted. Was it something they said? Something they didn't say? Did they miss a signal? Ignore a need? Cross a line they didn't know existed? They analyze your social media for clues about your emotional state. They ask mutual friends if you've said anything about them. They're gathering information like detectives trying to solve the mystery of your departure without having to actually ask you directly, because asking directly would require vulnerability they're not ready for. During this investigation, the avoidant often lands on incorrect explanations. They decide you must be seeing someone else. You must be going through a personal crisis. You must be punishing them for something specific. These explanations are more comfortable than the truth because they make your withdrawal about circumstances rather than about a fundamental decision you've made. If you're just distracted by someone new, the avoidant can tell themselves they could win you back if they tried. If you're going through something difficult, they can tell themselves you'll return when you're through it. These false explanations protect them from the reality that's too threatening to face. The confusion also involves a profound destabilization of the avoidant's self-concept. They thought they understood the dynamic between you. They thought they knew how you felt about them. They thought they could predict your behavior, but you've become unpredictable. You've stopped playing the role they assigned you in their psychological drama. This unpredictability is deeply unsettling because the avoidant's sense of safety comes from control and predictability. When they can't predict or control your behavior, they feel unmoored, anxious in ways they usually project onto others. The avoidant might reach out more during this stage, trying to provoke some response that clarifies what's happening. They're not pursuing you out of desire necessarily. They're pursuing understanding. They need to know what's going on so they can categorize it, make sense of it, return to some sense of control. But your responses remain detached or absent entirely, and the confusion intensifies. The avoidant is confronting the limits of their understanding, and it's terrifying. Stage 3, panic and desperate pursuit. The third stage erupts when the avoidant finally understands what's happening. You haven't given up temporarily. You've given up permanently. You're not pulling away a strategy. You're genuinely done. This realization triggers panic so intense, it overrides every avoidant defense mechanism. The person who claimed they didn't need anyone suddenly needs you desperately. The person who created distance now wants to eliminate it. The person who ran from intimacy now pursues it with an intensity that shocks both them and you. And the panic manifests as thoughts that won't stop. The avoidant can't concentrate on anything because their mind is consumed with you. They think about you constantly, obsessively, in ways they never did when you were available. At work, in the shower, trying to sleep, you're all they can think about. The person they took for granted now occupies every available space in their consciousness. They're experiencing the attachment anxiety they usually trigger in others, and it's devastating. During this stage, the avoidant often breaks their own patterns in dramatic ways. They reach out with vulnerability they've never shown before. They apologize with specificity they've never managed previously. They express feelings they've kept locked away for months or years. They make promises about change, about therapy, about being different. This sudden emotional availability isn't manipulation, though it might look like it from the outside. It's genuine panic, driving them to drop their defenses because losing you feels more dangerous than vulnerability. The desperate pursuit also involves grand gestures the avoidant would have mocked in others. They might show up unannounced. They might send long letters or messages detailing everything they feel. They might tell friends and family about you for the first time, hoping word gets back to you that they're serious. They're throwing everything at the wall, hoping something will stick, hoping something will prove to you that they've changed and that you should give them another chance. But here's what makes this stage particularly devastating for the avoidant. Their desperate pursuit often comes too late. You've already processed your feelings. You've already moved through anger and hurt into acceptance. You've already rebuilt your life without them. So their sudden emotional availability, which might have meant everything 6 months ago, now lands in a void. You're not moved by their vulnerability because you no longer have emotional investment in whether they're vulnerable or not. This realization, when it hits the avoidant, is crushing. The panic of this stage is also exhausting. The avoidant is experiencing emotions with an intensity they've never allowed themselves before. They're on an emotional roller coaster they can't control. The exhaustion compounds the panic because they're not sleeping, not eating properly, not functioning well in other areas of their life. Everything is consumed by the desperate need to undo what's been done, to reverse your decision, to get back what they didn't appreciate while they had it. Stage 4, grief and depression. The fourth stage settles in when the avoidant's desperate pursuit fails to change anything. You remain disengaged. You don't soften. You don't give them the opening they're looking for. The avoidant is forced to confront the finality of the loss, and grief crashes over them with suffocating weight. This isn't the mild sadness they felt at the end of previous relationships. This is comprehensive grief that touches every aspect of their existence. The depression that accompanies this grief is particularly brutal because the avoidant has no framework for processing it. They've spent their life avoiding painful emotions through dismissal and detachment, but they can't dismiss this. They can't detach from it. The pain is too present, too consuming, too undeniable. They're drowning in feelings they have no tools to manage, no experience navigating, no support system equipped to help them through. During this stage, the avoidant grieves multiple losses simultaneously. They're grieving you, obviously, the actual person and the connection you shared, but they're also grieving the future they didn't let themselves imagine when you were together, but now can see clearly. They're grieving their own potential, the person they could have been if they'd been braver. They're grieving their youth, the years they've wasted running from the very intimacy they craved. They're grieving the accumulated losses of every relationship they've sabotaged with the same patterns. The depression manifests in physical ways. The avoidant has no energy. Getting out of bed feels impossible. Basic self-care becomes overwhelming. They go through the motions of life while feeling dead inside. Color drains from their world. Nothing brings pleasure or interest. They're existing rather than living, moving through days that blur into meaningless repetition. Friends and family notice the change but don't know how to help because the avoidant won't talk about what's wrong. This stage also involves a profound loneliness that the avoidant can't escape. They've isolated themselves for so long, kept people at such distance that now when they're truly suffering, they have no one to turn to. They can't explain to friends why losing you has destroyed them because they never admitted how much you meant to them in the first place. They can't seek support because seeking support requires vulnerability they're still not capable of, so they suffer alone, which intensifies both the depression and the grief. The avoidant also grieves the version of themselves they presented to you versus who they actually were underneath. They regret the performance, the facade, the walls they maintained. They wish they could go back and be authentic, be vulnerable, be real, but it's too late. You never got to know who they really were beneath the avoidant exterior, and now you never will. This loss of what could have been the authentic connection that was possible but never actualized is perhaps the most painful aspect of the grief. Stage 5, acceptance and transformation or calcification. The fifth stage is where the avoidant's internal collapse either leads to genuine transformation or hardens into permanent calcification. This is the fork in the road where they must choose, consciously or unconsciously, whether to use this devastating experience as a catalyst for growth or as further evidence that avoiding intimacy was the right approach all along. For some avoidants, the complete collapse of their psychological framework creates space for something new to emerge. They hit rock bottom and decide they can't live like this anymore. They seek therapy, actually do the work rather than just attending sessions. They start examining their attachment patterns, tracing them back to childhood, understanding how their coping mechanisms developed. They learn to sit with uncomfortable emotions instead of immediately suppressing them. They practice vulnerability in small doses, building capacity for intimacy they never had before. This transformative path requires the avoidant to fundamentally reconstruct their identity. They have to abandon the narrative that they're fine alone, that they don't need anyone, that independence is the highest value. They have to accept that humans are wired for connection, that needing others isn't weakness, that vulnerability is courage rather than danger. This reconstruction is painful and slow. There are setbacks and moments of wanting to retreat to old patterns. But gradually, the avoidant develops new neural pathways, new emotional responses, new ways of relating that don't require constant distance and control. The transformed avoidant carries you with them always, not as torture, but as teacher. They understand that losing you was the price of their avoidance, and they're committed to never paying that price again. They become someone capable of sustained intimacy, of consistent presence, of the kind of partnership they couldn't offer you. Sometimes they hope they'll get another chance with you, that somehow you'll see they've changed, but mostly they focus on being different for themselves, for their own well-being, for future connections that deserve better than what they gave you. But other avoidants choose the path of calcification. They use the devastating experience as confirmation that caring too much is dangerous. They tell themselves that if they hadn't let you matter, they wouldn't be in this pain. They construct narratives about how relationships aren't worth the risk, how people will always leave, how protection through distance is the only sensible approach. They harden rather than soften, retreat further rather than learning to approach differently. The calcified avoidant becomes more defended, more dismissive, more convinced of their original approach. They may go through the motions of dating, but never let anyone close enough to matter. They keep people at even greater distance than before because distance feels like the only safety. They carry bitterness about what happened with you, blame you for giving up, tell themselves you weren't patient enough or understanding enough, anything to avoid accepting responsibility for their role in the loss. This calcification is tragic because it means the collapse led nowhere. All that pain, all that grief, all that devastating realization, and the avoidant learns nothing from it except to guard their heart more carefully. They remain stuck in patterns that will ensure they repeat this experience, losing person after person who gets tired of their emotional unavailability, never understanding that the problem isn't other people's impatience, but their own inability to sustain vulnerability. The calcified avoidant also develops a specific relationship with your memory. You become the villain in their narrative, the person who gave up too easily, who expected too much, who couldn't handle their need for space. This reframing protects their ego, but prevents growth. They can't learn from the experience if they refuse to see their role in it. So they carry you not as teacher, but as evidence, proof that relationships are risky and people are unreliable, and keeping their distance was wise all along. Whether the avoidant transforms or calcifies often depends on factors beyond just the loss itself. It depends on whether they have support systems that encourage growth, whether they've hit bottom hard enough that change feels necessary for survival, whether they're capable of the sustained discomfort that transformation requires, whether they have enough self-awareness to recognize their patterns rather than just blame circumstances, whether they're young enough that they have time to rebuild, or old enough that they feel hopeless about change. But regardless of which path they take, the internal collapse changes them permanently. They're not the same person they were before you gave up on them. The collapse either breaks them open or breaks them down, creates space for growth or hardens existing defenses, teaches them about the cost of their patterns, or confirms their belief that avoiding intimacy is necessary. The avoidant who emerges from the 5 stages is fundamentally different from the one who entered them, even if that difference is just becoming more of what they already were. When you gave up on the avoidant, you didn't just end a relationship. You triggered a psychological crisis that forced them to confront every assumption they held about themselves and connection. The 5 stages of internal collapse were inevitable once you withdrew the pursuit that allowed their avoidance to function without consequence. And whether that collapse ultimately serves them or destroys them, whether it leads to wisdom or bitterness, depends entirely on choices they make in the aftermath of losing someone who loved them before they were ready to be loved. The long shadow of collapse. What many people don't understand about the avoidance internal collapse is that it doesn't end cleanly. Even after they've moved through all 5 stages, even after they've reached some form of acceptance, the collapse leaves residue that affects them for years. The avoidant carries the memory of the collapse the way someone carries the memory of a near-death experience. It fundamentally altered their perception of themselves and their place in the world. They're marked by it in ways that shape every subsequent relationship and interaction. For the avoidant who chose transformation, the shadow manifests as hypervigilance about their patterns. They're constantly monitoring themselves for signs of old behaviors. When they feel the urge to create distance, they panic slightly, wondering if they're falling back into dysfunction. When intimacy feels uncomfortable, they question whether they've actually changed or just convinced themselves they have. This self-monitoring is exhausting, but necessary. It's the price of remaining committed to growth rather than defaulting to familiar patterns that feel safer, but lead to the same devastating outcomes. The transformed avoidant also carries grief about timing. They've become capable of the love and intimacy they couldn't offer you. And that capacity feels both like victory and like tragedy. Victory because they've grown beyond their limitations. Tragedy because the growth came too late to save what you had together. They meet new people and can show up differently, more authentically, more consistently. But there's always a part of them that wishes they could show this version of themselves to you, that wishes you could see they finally became the partner they should have been all along. They wonder frequently whether you'd take them back if you knew how much they'd changed, whether you'd be willing to try again with this new version of them, whether the transformation would be enough to overcome the hurt they caused. These wonderings are painful because they usually go unanswered. Most avoidants never reach back out because they're afraid the answer is no, afraid that reopening communication would disrupt whatever peace you found, afraid that their transformation isn't actually as complete as they believe it is. So they carry the question mark forever, never knowing if the person who mattered most would recognize or value the change they've made. For the avoidant who chose calcification, the shadow is different but equally persistent. They carry a specific kind of bitterness that colors everything. They tell themselves they were right to be guarded, right to keep people at a distance, right to prioritize self-protection. But underneath the righteous certainty is a hollow awareness that they're lying to themselves. They know, even if they never admit it, that their defensiveness costs them something real. They know they're choosing loneliness over risking vulnerability. They know their patterns guarantee they'll never have what they claim they don't want. The calcified avoidant also develops a complicated relationship with their own capacity for feeling. The collapse proved they could feel deeply, that they weren't as emotionally dead as they sometimes claimed. They experienced devastating pain, which means they're capable of devastating love. This knowledge is inconvenient because it contradicts their preferred narrative about being above emotional entanglement. So they suppress it, push it down, try to forget the depth of feeling they experienced when they lost you. But it resurfaces in quiet moments, reminding them they're not as invulnerable as they pretend to be.